Welcome to the 49th episode of the interview series. The interview series is a production of One Week Critique, an Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our website, oneweekcritique.com. That's the number one, weekcritique.com. And please like and subscribe to help us continue producing valuable content. I'm Matthew Schmidt, joined today by Tyler Barton. Tyler Barton's debut full-length book of fiction, Eternal Nights at the Nature Museum, was published by Sarabande Books in November 2021. He's the author of The Quiet Part Loud, which came out in 2019, winner of the Turnbuckle Chapbook Contest from Split Lip Press. His short fiction has been published widely in journals and magazines, such as Kenyon Review, Subtropics, the Iowa Review, Gulf Coast, Cincinnati Review, Copper Nickel, and others. Stories from Eternal Night at the Nature Museum have been awarded prizes and honors from Kenyon Review, Phoebe Journal, the Chicago Review of Books, the Best of the Net, and Best Small Fictions of 2020. He serves as the communication manager for the Adirondack Center for Writing in Saranac Lake, New York. Welcome, Tyler.
Thanks so much for having me. This is exciting.
Excellent. So today we'll be looking at Stay, Go from Eternal Night at the Nature Museum. And I thought we would just start off by talking a little bit about what your composition process looks like.
Yeah, my process is, I think, maybe a little backwards or a little bit non-standard, which is that I tend to not like to write about, I tend to not like to know what it is that I'm going to write about. I like to find a first line, whether it's something I overheard or me responding to something in my head, like thinking the line in response to something someone says or something I see on the street. I usually write it in my phone, like as a sentence in this note called poetry. And it's just like has all these notes of like poetic lines or lines I like. And when I write, I will usually take a line out and try to write after that line until that line, that opening line feels true. So it's like I'm trying to compose a story or a piece of writing that is making that first line work, making that first line true in some way. And that isn't to say that I never change what the opening line is from draft one to the final draft, though I'd say more often than not, the first sentence that I first write does end up being the first sentence because I have this kind of quixotic devotion to like trying to make the line that inspired me to start writing, trying to make it work as a first line. And that's kind of the case with the story as well. It also leads to a lot of stories that are never finished because I can't make that first line work and I won't let go of the opening being what the opening is. And yeah, so that's my process. It's not super fruitful and I don't suggest it to other people. I think if you like have an idea of the story you want to tell or the themes you want to hit and you sit down to try to come up with the best way of delivering that message or telling that story, I think that you should go with that. But for me, I rarely know what it is I want to talk about. I kind of want to be more improvisational. It's kind of like I'm playing improv with myself and trying to keep the ball in the air.
And so these things, do you mostly see something happen while you're out in the world, when you're watching something, and that becomes the springboard?
Yeah, a lot of times it's just being it's being a thief. It's just like hearing something and stealing it. The first sentence that starts Eternal Night at the Nature Museum is Luther buys cars. It's the opening of Once Nothing, Twice Shatter. And that was like on a billboard in Minnesota when I was in grad school there, and I drove past it. It just said Luther buys cars. And then I was just thinking to myself while I was driving, like, what if a sentence started with Luther buys cars? Like, what would need to happen to make that interesting? And then it was just, well, he's buying everybody's car, and he's buying your mom's car. He's bought the mayor's car. And then like, why is he buying all these cars? So like, that's the process. And it's not, Yeah, it can change from thing to thing. I think with Stay and Go, it was the idea that I think someone said in a class or something that every story is a question of whether to stay or to go. Like that's the central question behind all action, is like to stay or to go. And then I was like, yeah, but what if you do neither? And, in my mind, it's kind of just like a snarky response. But then I was like, well, that could be an interesting way to start a story, is like call it Stay and Go and then have this first sentence say, but we did neither. I think also influenced by Stuart Diebeck. He has a story, We Didn't. And I always loved the way that story starts, because it just starts with we didn't. And then it talks about all the things they didn't do. So yeah, I hope that answers the question, but
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So speaking of Stay Go, maybe you could give us a brief summary of the story, and then I'll pull it up and ask you to read a little section of it.
Yeah, for sure. So Stay and Go is the story of two teenage boys who are in love, and they have run away from their home. They are currently staying in a hotel and trying to figure out what to do next. They know they wanted to run away. The specific reasons for that aren't super clear in the story, but everything from teenage angst to restlessness to parents not understanding what's going on with them. They run away, and then they're kind of in this in-between space. They're trying to figure out what do they do now, and they are kind of wasting and biding their time in a hotel and spending a lot of time in the elevator of the hotel playing games, which is they're kind of luxuriating in this time that they have before they have to make a decision.
Great.
Yeah.
I will pull up this first draft here. And whenever you're ready, I will ask you to go ahead and read.
Sure. I'm going to read like the end of the story, the last 3 sections of the first draft. Growing up, I learned something I don't think most kids know, which is that the best part of a vacation is before it ever starts. That preceding day and a half when the thing feels finally here, when you're packing, singing, making plans for classmates to collect your worksheets, the restless sleep you take on the eve of the drive, nothing, not even the first turn in the road, the first stop at Sunoco, the first rip on a bag of Sun Chips, nothing yet has ended. No one is screaming. Neither parent has had enough. The single ticket flight back to Pennsylvania is still unbooked. A jellyfish has not stung you yet. A stranger is not pissing in your hand. I think that what Marco and I didn't know we truly wanted was to be in that box when the machine got stuck between floors, to be trapped and not at fault for it, to have men in yellow uniforms pry open the doors and pull us to safety. The night before Marco had come for me, sleeping out on the broken trampoline, the black vinyl bed sagging into the wet grass, was the best day of my life. That restless sleep still contained every part of the world. I remember I woke to the rattling of springs, terrified. After that guard, we switched hotels. The Hilton was not the same. Their elevators had AC, colored lights, and doors that opened on both sides. Marco and I stood in the top floor lobby waiting until both sets opened. We sprinted the 8 steps to the open doors and frog leapt, trying to clear the elevator completely, aiming to land in the opposite lobby. We never made it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I really enjoy how Marco and the narrator travel in the elevator, but they can't decide where to go, what to do. Maybe you could discuss a little bit about how you think identity and desire both promote and retard action.
Yeah, I write about this a lot, which is the liminal space, or the spaces in between things, and it's often the resistance about making a decision, or the narrator touches on it a little bit in that section I just read. It's like once you have started something, then it's already ending. And I kind of realized that as a teenager, and was bothered by it. It made me want to start recording things, taking videos, writing things down, because I felt that like as soon as something fun had started, it had already started to end. And so I look for often in fiction those places where though a character does have desires for more, they can find these spaces where they're kind of sitting in the space before action, which is a hard task because it's not always that much fun to read in action, or to read somebody who is not yet ready to make a decision, or is in an in-between space. But it's how I feel that I spend most of my life, in these in-between spaces. And I'm not unambitious. I have lots of dreams and desires, and do feel compelled to do things, but I often am searching for spaces where I can kind of rest in the in-between. And I think that's what this story is all about.
Yeah, I forget who said this, but I think I read recently that someone said the people who are happiest are the ones not thinking about the past or the future, but
Yeah.
living like directly in whatever moment they're in,
Mhm.
because then all the weight of what has happened and what is to come is not weighing on your mind.
Right. Yeah, it's I think this comes up in my stories a lot because have the I've read a lot of Eastern philosophy and a lot of pop Eastern philosophy as well. I mean, I have to admit that Ram Dass is like is just my hero. I've listened to hours and hours of Ram Dass speaking. And though I'm not excellent with meditative practice, or I don't really consider myself a Buddhist, I like what Brad Listy, who's one of my literary heroes, calls Buddhish. I call myself Buddhish. Like, I feel like those ideas do permeate my life, but I don't really live them out day to day, but I aspire to. So yeah, I'm all about that. Like, can we just enjoy right now? Can we take, if we are able to take right now for everything that it is, would that be enough? And I'm hopeful that it will be at some point.
Indeed, don't we all? So the details in the story, I love them. There's a Lady Gaga wig, the
Yeah.
Sunoco, the Nerd's rope, and sun chips, just to name a few. What do you think is gained and lost when including pop culture references, when specificity anchors a piece in time?
Yeah, I think that much more is gained than what is lost. I will say that I understand the hesitancy to use pop culture references, or to use colloquialisms, or to use things that may not exist in 20 years in the stories, because we should always be thinking our stories are timeless, right? That they're going to be read in 100 years. I'm not sure that, I don't really care about that. I mean, to be honest, like, I want people who are alive right now to understand my stories. And I think that for me, more than anything, what's important about a piece of fiction is that it lulls you into the dream of, like, that it's a real thing that's happening, that it makes you kind of forget you're reading and you're in that world. And the only way for me to inhabit a world is for the writer to convince me that the world is real. And to me, the real world is filled with ephemera like nerds ropes and sun chips, and specific place names, and things that might not, and every reader might not come across it, might come across it. And okay, what am I trying to say? Not every reader will come across those references and immediately conjure to mind what that thing is. But I try to make sure that no plot points or anything like really central to the narrative of the story is hinging on whether or not somebody knows this detail. I actually just did this last night. I was working on a story and I tweeted, does anyone know what I mean when I say Merlin, the phone app for birdsong? Just because I kept referring to Merlin in the story that I'm writing. And I was like, if nobody else knows what Merlin is, it's going to be so annoying. But like, so many people are like, yes, I know what that is. So I was able to test that. But so it is something I think about. I'm cognizant of it, but I think more often than not, I'm going to be like, yes, leave that specific detail in, leave that flavor of LaCroix in the narrator's hand, because it just makes the world feel real to me. And some of my favorite writers, like one that comes to mind for this is Lucia Berlin. In all of Lucia Berlin's stories, like every paragraph, there is some specific reference to something that I'm not quite sure what it is. It may just be the name of a street, or like a hill in the town she's talking about, maybe the name of a diner, and she doesn't even really tell you it's a diner. She just says it's Claude's or something. I love those details, and that makes me feel like I'm with the narrator on the streets of that town. And it doesn't matter if I don't immediately know what the things were. I can just kind of trust that the author is the authority on this, and that they're leading me in the right direction. Yeah, so I think that's my position on it. I think more is gained than is lost, but I could see there being some lost, like just being confusion, but I try to make sure that no details would confuse too much.
Well, I think the by having these very specific things, even if someone's reading this 100 years from now,
Mhm.
they're going to be allowed the opportunity to time travel. Much like
Yeah.
when you're reading Lucia Berlin, right, you get
Right.
to do that. You get to be on the street and try and figure out what Claude's is and
Yeah.
like what type of people go into Claude's, what the atmosphere is, things like that. And I think that's one of the things that it offers. Um, you know, this other idea, I like thinking about the idea of who's going to be reading you in, 100 years, 50
Right.
years, right? Like it's an interesting idea, and it's one that none of us will be able to answer probably,
Mhm.
unless some drastic things happen where science takes huge steps forward.
Yeah.
But when thinking about your collection, there's a lot of quirky characters and situations, and that makes sense based on how you begin a story, right? Um,
Mhm.
what makes you want to explore the oddity, and how much research do you undertake?
Hmm. Yeah, like oddity and weirdness, borderline absurdity. Those are all things that motivate me to want to write a story. I often will talk about my writing as in this genre I've kind of made up for myself, which is ridiculous realism, which is that like the things that happen in my stories could happen in real life, but it's likely that they wouldn't. Some more than others. I think Stay and Go is fairly like it's not that unbelievable, but there's some that push believability a little bit, and I always want to be in that space of pushing believability. It's related to, well, the fact that as for most of my childhood, I thought reading was boring. And I didn't really get into reading until I was like in 11th grade when I read Kurt Vonnegut. So, excuse me. It's important to me for writing to just be exciting and kind of loud and a little bit in your face, because I really want my reader to just be entertained and come along with me and look at these things that aren't often looked at. Uh, yeah, so that's kind of why I'm drawn to oddity, and it also has to do with like what's the characters are doing in this story. They're in the elevator of this hotel and they're doing these different kind of social experiments, or what could be seen as like light pranks, where they'll like stand backwards in the elevator so that when people get on, they have to figure out if they're standing in the wrong direction, and they're just like woken up a little bit. They're like, what's going on here? Did that a lot as a teenager, just in any social situations where it could like make the people around me wonder, wait, what's going on right now? Is this real life? Like just kind of snap out of the uh daily doldrums of like everything is ordinary, everything's always the same. Is there like little things that you can do, especially like innocuous or just like harmless things that turn the world in a different light in a way, to make it seem odd or make it seem like you're in a movie suddenly or something. So that influences the kind of stories I want to tell, is people who are making the world seem a little bit more fun and weird than it is, or than it seems, because I think it is incredibly, like everything is incredibly weird if you just pay attention to it for a long enough. So yeah.
I would agree. I think life is very odd and strange, and we kind of go around thinking like it's it's like in a box, and like if this happens, then you do this, right? Like that's kind of like how you learn things. It's
Right.
like, well, if the stove's hot, don't touch it. Like that would
Yeah.
be foolish. But
Right.
but everything's not that simple on the surface.
Yeah.
And I really think it's interesting that you're writing this first line, whatever it may be, Luther sells cars,
Mhm.
um, and you want to write until it feels true, and then you're going to go beyond that and push the
Mhm.
believability of it, right?
Right.
And that's fascinating because I feel like that does get at something that's true to life, where it's like something good happens to you and you're like, did that really happen? Like, was it that cool? Or is it just like really neat to me to have that thing?
Right.
And on the other hand, someone's telling you a story and you're like, really, that actually happened? And you're like, so it's that interesting space between suspending disbelief and like going all in and being
Yeah.
like, yeah, I'm there with you.
Right. And I'm glad you brought that up because that is part of the process too. The next step, like I'm trying to write until I can make that first line work. And that's why a lot of times pieces I write end up being flash, or they end up being, I write a lot of microfiction, and lately have been writing like prose poetry or just straight up poetry, like trying to get to the point or get to the truth as quickly as possible. But in a lot of the stories in this book, it's me trying to make that first sentence true, but then also as the pages go on, I'm trying to keep myself interested. Like I have to first be interested and entertained, or else I am convinced no one else will be. I know that if I'm interested and entertained, it does not guarantee that everyone else will be. I know that for sure, but I think there will be there's no chance for it if I'm not like entertained. So stories do tend to, the oddness comes out more and more as they go on, because I'm kind of like digging and digging and digging and trying to keep things interesting and entertaining for myself. Yeah. And sometimes it works out beautifully. And honestly, for every story that's in this book, there are 12 other stories that didn't make it they never got finished. There's so many false starts in my desktop. It's just ridiculous. So anyway.
Well, I admit, I forget what the story's called, but it's the one with the ornate mailboxes.
Yeah.
That one.
Mailboxes of Southern Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that one, when it began, I was like, all right, what's he going to do with this? You know what I mean? Like, I was like, all right, I've seen you do some really neat things, but this one feels like harder to me for some reason.
Yeah.
In the end, I felt like it stood out as like one of the stories that stood out, like where I was like, I can visualize it. I can visualize what's happening with the neighbors and the cars and all of these things. And so it does get you to a place where it's like you get inside actually the reader's mind in a manner that I think is really fruitful to engagement to a story for the reader. So
yeah, well, it requires a reader who's going to be willing to take that deep breath when they encounter that odd first page and be like, okay, I'll give you a couple more pages to convince me that this world is real. And I'm glad to hear it worked for you. That's how I feel when reading one of my heroes, one of the people who made me want to study writing fiction at all. And this is not original at all. Everyone who looks like me says this, but George Saunders is a huge influence. And there's so many George Saunders stories from the first time I opened one of his books where I was like, I have no idea what's going on for the first page and a half, because the narrator's voice is so stylized and so specific, and he's not holding my hand, he's not explaining to me what these things are, but I'm like, I learned enough from reading a couple stories that did work that I was like, if I trust him and read the first 3 pages, I'll figure it out. I feel like his novel was like I had to read 30 pages before I had any grasp on the reality of the book. And then once I did, I was like, oh my God, this world that I'm in is amazing. It was just the threshold into it took so long. I'd like to keep that threshold of like when you're in the dream of the story. I'd like to keep it shorter than I do sometimes, but some of the premises are a bit odd and quirky. So it takes a reader who's willing to have patience. So I appreciate that you had the patience to push into it and found some rewards.
Yeah. Well, I love odd and quirky things myself. So it wasn't a hard sell for me. It was just like an impressive thing that you did it over and over. You know what I mean?
Oh, cool. Yeah, no, I appreciate hearing that. Thank you.
All right, let's take a look at the final draft here.
Okay.
And see how it has changed. Whenever you're ready, I'll ask you to read.
Okay. I'll start at the same spot. Growing up, I learned something I don't think most kids know, which is that the best part of a vacation is before it ever starts. That preceding day and a half when the thing feels finally here, when you're packing, singing, making plans for classmates to collect your worksheets, the restless sleep you take on the eve of the drive. Nothing, not even the first turn in the road, the first stop at Sunoco, the first rip in the bag of Sun Chips, nothing yet has ended. No one is screaming, neither parent has had enough. The single ticket flight back to Pennsylvania is still unbooked. A jellyfish has not yet stung you. A stranger is not pissing on your hand. What I mean is that what I mean is the night Marco came for me, sleeping in the backyard on the broken trampoline, the black vinyl bed sagging into the wet grass, was the best day of my life. That restless sleep contained every part of the world. I remember I woke to the rattling of springs, terrified. After the guard, we switched hotels. The Marriott was no destination, but there we were, stuck in another interim space. These elevators had AC, colored lights, and the weirdest thing ever, doors on either side of the compartment. You'd reach a floor and have to guess which set would open. It unnerved me. But then Marco discovered how at the top floor, both doors opened at once. The new plan was to stand outside the elevator, and when those doors slid open, run, leap, clear the empty elevator completely. I tried to imagine us landing firm-footed in the opposite lobby. We stood on the 24th story and waited for the bell to ding, for our path to open, for the double row of doors to unfold like a swallow. And when they did, we saw straight through to the other side. You, he said. No, you, I mean it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So you had mentioned in our email correspondence that this particular story was published on 3 different occasions in 3 different iterations. And I was wondering if you could kind of speak to what you learned through this process in the different drafting stages.
Yeah, I'm going to go through the history of it a little bit because I want to point out a few people who have been really instrumental in the story taking its final form. I'll always tell people that if you can find a good editor or even just a good reader that you can exchange work with, like there's nothing like that. And the first step for this story was I wrote a draft of it and shared it with the person I always share my first draft with, which is the writer Pete Stevens. I went to grad school with him, and the story grew a little bit. It grew by like 500 words after that workshop with Pete, and it ended up staying at about the length that it was in after that workshop. And he just really wanted me to clarify some things, and he's really good at calling me on my BS. Like if I'm trying to phone something in, he'll be like, you got to sell this more. I don't believe this. Or are you sure that there are hotel doors that open on both sides? Like he'll push me, and then I'll know that I have to explain a little bit more about what I mean about what I mean about an elevator door that opens on both sides. And so that was really helpful. And then I submitted the story to Gulf Coast, and Isle McElroy was the editor there. And we ended up taking that, what I'll call a second draft. The draft I shared with Pete was already a 3rd or 4th draft, for me. And then, but it was the earliest one, the earliest document I could find. So then I sent it to Gulf Coast, and then it was accepted with the caveat that Isle wanted to work on the piece a little bit, and we ended up reshaping the ending a lot. I was kind of set on this ending where it ended with the sentence, "We never made it," because I thought it had this cool double meaning of like, we never made the jump trying to jump across the thing, but also we never made it as a couple, or we never made it as like, whatever this relationship is, it didn't last, So I thought it kind of like ended both stories, what was happening in the moment, and kind of suggested a 3rd act where these 2 split up. And I still kind of like that idea, but it just wasn't, it was maybe a little bit too final and too much like a big period on the end of the story. And Isle helped me to figure out a little bit of a slower ending, a little bit more patient, so that we can like rest and see the scene of them trying to jump through the elevator doors. And also to bring back a motif that was introduced earlier in the story of this game they play called Know You, where the elevator would open, and sometimes what they would do is stand up in the front and not go out. And they would do this act where it's like, no, you go first. No, you go first. No, seriously, you. And they would do that as long until somebody reacted or someone pushed them aside, or until the doors shut again and they just stayed on the elevator, which I always thought was a funny idea. But so that is brought back at the end as kind of a refrain with they're actually too afraid to do this leap and they're passing back the buck, like, you do it. No, you do it first. And I think it's a more beautiful ending, but it did, at first it was hard for me to change that final line, but I'm really glad I did. So it was published in Gulf Coast, and then it was published in my chapbook, which came out in 2019. It's called The Quiet Part Loud. And there were some edits that went on between this Gulf Coast version to the chapbook version, but they were mostly line edits. Mostly Amanda Miska at Split Lip Press. She used to be the founder and editor of Split Lip Press. She's no longer there, but she was really great on a sentence level with helping me to tweak some sentences and also make some moments more believable. There's a kind of a difficult moment in the story where the main characters are caught by a security guard, and one jokingly like suggests a blowjob to like go free or something. And it kind of like used to just sit in the story as this matter of fact thing, but she was like, this just feels weird. We got to make it feel a little bit more believable. So that scene, which happens right before the section I just read, that scene is fleshed out a little bit more. And then it was published a third time because when I was putting together the stories for Eternal Night at the Nature Museum, I realized that what the book is about home. It's about people either finding a new home, leaving the home that they're in, or settling on an idea of home in a place that they don't want to be. So all the stories related to home in some way. And this was just too perfect of a story about finding home in this place between places, finding home in an elevator or home in a hotel. So I ended up including it again. And then it went through another, pass, because Kristen Miller, my editor at Sarabande, did a pass through the whole book, and we did some edits, but nothing major. The biggest edits changed from before I submitted to Gulf Coast and then working on it with Isle McElroy. And I'm really grateful for those changes. And I know I've been answering this question forever, but I also have to point out that at some point, I realized this just today, as I was going back through all the old drafts, at some point, I also shared this story with the writer Elle Nash, who we used to trade stories back and forth. And there's some stories in her collection that I've workshopped with her. So she is the one who suggested adding this idea of the origami bird that the narrator is folding often throughout the story, just folding a swallow. And it's a very difficult like fold to do, and that's explained a little bit in the story. And I bring that up because that image of the swallow is actually returned to again at the end, and that's another note of like kind of giving the story some circular logic, or some what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, just another refrain, another like ding, like of something you remember from earlier in the story of when the narrator's folding the birds, and at the end the doors unfold like a swallow. So she was really great at helping me. She was like, it needs to be a specific origami bird, and here's one I found that I think you'll like, because it's very complicated and there's this weird thing where you have to unfold it to finish it. And it was just like this great poetic thing, and I really have to credit her for that idea. So so many hands have been on these 1,800 words. I've gone through so many drafts, but there's at least 4 people who have also had a hand in it, and I'm grateful to all of them. So find yourself a good editor and listen to them if you can. That's my advice always. So
Amen.
Yeah.
They are, you can't do it without them.
Yeah, I always tell people, like I talk to writers a lot, and they're always like, yeah, I got the story accepted, but the editor wants to do all of these edits, and like it's really annoying. And I'm always like, I do know that first time when you get the email and you can see all of the red marks on the page, like that it is, you have to brace a little bit, but I've never had a situation where the story didn't become much better because I took, at least 80% of the edits suggested to me, and really worked on the revisions. I've had great experiences with editors at LitMag. So yeah, lean into that for sure.
So this quote comes from the story. Quote, "That restless sleep contained every part of the world," end quote. And that refers to the narrator's night before escaping with Marco. What do you think waiting, dreaming, and reminiscence offer someone that action does not? And is there a secret to writing broad generalizations and having them land in shorter work?
Yeah, I think this comes back to stuff I was talking about before about um the kind of holiness of interim spaces or of liminal spaces and how I seek those out. And I also try to find them in fiction and pause in them. So um yeah, of that whole idea of like the night before the thing happens, there's any possibility, everything is possible because it hasn't happened yet. So that's exciting. Like life feels like it's moving, but it hasn't really moved forward yet because you haven't gotten in the car, but like you're about to. So those spaces I just think are incredibly exciting because there's so many possibilities that are still there. And as soon as you start making decisions like which way you're going to turn at the end of the road, you start having consequences, and consequences suck. So I mean, it's how you learn. And I know that that's like the hard work of being human, but I don't know, I prefer to be in more of a place of equanimity and stasis if possible. So I think that's what I'm getting at there. As far as like this generalization kind of working, I think it only those kinds of sentences I really only work if they're true to that specific narrator. I try to always remember that when I write a sentence that's like a statement about something or about the way the world is, like it's coming from a narrator, and I write a lot of first person narrators. Even if it is a third person narrator, the narrator is still its own entity, and it doesn't have to be me per se. So characters can say things and narrators can say things that about the world, and I do believe them, but I also know they're never going to hold up in every situation, but it's true to that story and that character's perspective. And as long as it feels like that's the truth of that character, then I'll go with it. And I'll always be very vigilant, or not vigilant, just prepared for one of my readers, and often it is Pete, to be like, no, this doesn't work, because he'll tell me if my trying to be like reflective or trying to make a statement about the world or say something kind of broadly poetic, if it works, he'll be like, this is earned and this was beautiful. And if it doesn't, he'll just be like, this is bullshit, get rid of this. So, and I'm very appreciative of that. So I don't know, it doesn't always work, and you just got to have lots of readers.
I know, I was thinking about in for revision, when you're revising your own work, there's always lines or ideas that you're like, this is one of my best ever.
Oh
And
yeah.
and then someone comes along and they're like, I mean, this is really neat and interesting, but it's gotta go, man. Like it has to go. It doesn't fit here, and here's why.
Right.
And it's always one of those things that I think early on when you're beginning to write and revise, it's one of the hardest things to kind of get over,
Mhm.
but it becomes much easier somehow over time because you're so used to uh, cutting things that don't fit, and but you learn how to maybe use them elsewhere, or use it in a story somehow, or whatever you're working on, in a different light. So I find that like to be one of the best things to learn about revision over time.
Without a doubt. It's very hard to kill darlings, but I always, almost every story that I have has a folder, and then in that folder is a bunch of drafts, and usually in that folder there's another document called cut from Stay and Go, and then it'll be like sentences or paragraphs that were cut from this, because I really am way too precious about my writing and I can't let things go. It's a little bit ridiculous that there's all of these things cut, and I want to save them because one day I'll go back to them, but I don't even remember what they are. But it's like, it makes me feel better to keep them in a file. So I definitely do save the things that get cut, and cutting is tough. It's tough. A lot of grad school conversations and workshop conversations came back to this idea of, we got to trim the fat. Like this story, we know what it's about, but you've got a lot of extra stuff in here, a lot of darlings or whatever, and we got to trim some of the fat. I'm often on the side that says leave fat in, and I should not use that terminology, but leave that stuff that seems maybe incidental or like not central to the story, as long as it's not egregious. Like I like to try to leave those things in because that's the fun of writing for me. And I always want writing to be fun. I want reading to be fun. So I want those kind of those things that might seemingly be cut. I like to keep them in if I can. I guess I'm kind of talking out of both sides of my mouth here, saying like you got to cut things, but also you can leave things in. I'm more apt to like leave an odd detail, or like we were talking about before, like leaving a line about a specific bag of chips in a story than to leave in a broad generalization or a broad like reflective statement about the world in that doesn't work. Like I don't try to keep stuff like that as much as I try to keep the like weird and fun and juicy details. But yeah.
Perhaps future retrospectives of writers will include the detritus that they have cut
Yeah.
as like a document, like a book, instead of like their letters, because people aren't sending letters nearly at the rate they were sending before.
Right.
I would be really interested to read, those types of things, because you would learn something either way,
Yeah. I totally agree. I mentioned this app or this note in my phone in my notes app called Poetry, and which is just like the lines that come to me throughout the day or things I overhear, observations. And when I do take bits of that out to use in a story or use in a poem or use anywhere, I don't often like take them out of that. I just copy them and paste. So like that big long running note is just kind of like my notebook and is like a diary of like all the things. So you'd see lines that do end up appearing in things, but also things that never made it. And yeah, I've had kind of big headed ideas about like one day we'll just publish this entire poetry app or the poetry note as like my letters or something. But I don't know. It does give me comfort knowing it's there. It's just kind of like, yeah, it's my diary in a way.
So I have to ask this question because I find it a fascinating question. But what experiments on audiences have you attempted that are similar to what Marco and the narrator do in their elevator studies?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked this because this is so much of just what my childhood and teenage years were, really mostly from like age probably like 11 to even well into college, like 21, was just being out in public with my friends and trying to wake people, again, it's like very presumptuous to think that everyone around us is asleep in the like doldrums of daily living or something, but trying to do things that just like make the world seem weird to people. And as teenagers, that often pushed too far into like pranks, never specifically harmful, but like maybe mean-spirited pranks in certain ways. So we love to prank people, we love to steal signs and steal things. But when I always was having the most fun with my friends is when we came up with a really creative or smart idea where no one really got hurt, but like was the people involved would be put into a strange situation. So this is everything from like being 13 and being dropped off at the mall and doing this stunt, which doesn't even sound that funny, but just is one of my best memories of like sitting in the massage chairs that are often set up in the middle of the mall and then acting out this thing where like, hey, have you ever tried this? Oh yeah, give it a shot, man. And then acting as if it's electrocuting you while you're sitting in it, and then literally falling on the ground and like shaking on the ground like before people as they start to like look at you. Again, that may be a little bit mean-spirited, but that kind of thing, everything from that to we did a lot of like this game that we would call mirroring houses, where we go into a into a development and like take one house on one side of the street and take all of the yard like ornaments and everything from like if they had a trampoline to a planter and put it on at the other house across the street in the same location, and take that house's ornaments and put them across the street so that when people woke up they would see like their things in their neighbor's yard but like in the exact same place. And again, that is shitty to do because that requires someone to move their trampoline back across the street. So I get it. We were dicks, but like it was just like a way of trying to make the world seem like malleable, or like that there was like weirdness out there, or that you could like wake up and things could be different. And I don't know. So that just encouraged a lot of the different things we would do. But yeah, and those are some of the better, I don't even know if they are good. They're interesting to me examples, but a lot of my childhood was spent doing that kind of thing. Very influenced by shows like Jackass, or shows, there's a great British show, British prank show called Trigger Happy TV, that was better than Jackass because it wasn't mean spirited. It was just like doing weird things in public and then filming the public's responses. And we used to use a video camera a lot too, and try to do things that were strange in public and just zoom in on people's faces, just so later we could like laugh about like how hard someone else was laughing, or how surprised somebody looked, or how scared or something. So yeah, that was being a kid, and I miss that kind of stuff. So I often write about it. My chapbook, The Quiet Part Loud, is mostly stories about kids like screwing around in their town and trying to find something fun to do. I should have started this out by saying I grew up like in the country in southern Pennsylvania, on a street with like 3 houses on it, and we had to make up our own fun. We also were straight edge, so we were like vehemently against drinking or doing drugs, so we couldn't really get our rocks off that way. We had to like go out and rearrange people's furniture, or like yeah, I don't know, do strange things like that. So I know it's kind of rambling, but
Oh no, it's fascinating. I went through multiple jobs you could have. You could have been a psychologist if you weren't a writer.
Well, my mom is a psychologist, so that makes sense.
There we go. Well,
good call.
It's it changing perspective, even as in the mirroring, right? It does something to your mind, to others' minds. And I think, at our core, it's kind of trying to figure out like, why do we think how we think? And what happens if we purposefully push ourselves to think differently?
Yeah.
What is the response? And
I think that's at the heart. That's at the heart of it for sure. But I have to say too that I realize that it stems more, I guess, from the desire for attention. Like there's more interesting things behind the desire for attention, but on the surface it's always like, how can we get attention? It's like, let's go make people look at us in public because we do a stupid thing. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. It's just realizing like that should be said, the desire for attention. And there's so many characters in this book that is what they want, or they're dealing with that. They're trying to reckon with that desire for attention, what it means, and either push against it or lean into it. And a lot of people just wanting to be seen or to have an audience, even if the audience is only one person. So
well, I mean, the world is so big. You kind of feel small just being one entity within this larger sphere. Yeah. And it's interesting that you bring up drugs and alcohol versus kind of, I don't know, pranks. Right. But like both of those are outlets. And, it seems that it's necessary for people to have outlets of some sort, whether they be detrimental to them or whether they be positive to them is another question, of course. But it does seem necessary that people have things to do that are not just like, I need to do this job so I can make this money so I can eat and sleep somewhere safe.
Right. Absolutely. I sometimes think that if the town I grew up in, which was like very, very, very small and very rural, or even the high school I was in had a strong art program or something, some way for my restlessness and my need for attention and my like, creativity, like that was behind a lot of the pranks and stunts we pulled, was I think a creative spirit. If that could have been absorbed into like a good arts program, I think I would have, I don't know, gotten in less trouble for sure. And, but I don't know. Yeah, you got to find a place to put that stuff. And I think that's why, I believe in art so much, and especially in community art. And that's the kind of, those are the spaces that I work in professionally. I've worked in children's museums, nature museums, community art classes, and I work for a literary nonprofit now that does a lot of work with kids. And just trying to find kids who have that creative energy and give them something healthy to put it into. Not that I think all the things we did were unhealthy, but certainly they were a little misguided at times. So yeah.
Indeed. Well, last question, I promise. I have to ask it because I got to geek out reading your collection, uh,
Yeah.
because there's a story that is based on old Modest Mouse music,
Mhm.
particularly The Lonesome Crowded West. And so I'm just curious, why do you like Modest Mouse so much? What
Mhm.
got you into it? And what's your favorite Modest Mouse song?
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I was got into Modest Mouse probably when I was like 16, maybe 17. I was playing guitar then and in a metal band, actually, like a metalcore band. But I had a friend who was really into indie music and showed me Modest Mouse. I think I fell in love with Modest Mouse originally because of the lyrics. I was originally a little bit put off by Isaac Brock's voice, as I think many people are, at least at first, if not forever. He's not a great singer, but he uses his kind of flawed instrument in such an amazing way. But besides that, his lyrics are just so poetic, and they tell stories. They are funny. They say things that I didn't really know you could say in songs. I thought at that point, like, was really into punk music, and it was always like angry and loud and trying to be powerful. And I felt like Modest Mouse songs were like, the lyrics were like about not being powerful, and also they're just about like daily life and daily things. And I think his Brock's like ability to just create a world in a song is incredible. The story in the book is called Cowboy Man Major Player, and it was actually commissioned by an editor at Many Loops, which is a kind of very weird literary journal online. They're doing really interesting stuff, but it's all about things that are recursive. And she was like, yeah, maybe you could write a recursive story about Modest Mouse. And that's how this kind of came out. And I ended up putting in a lot of Modest Mouse references. So yeah, I love the lyrics. I love the sound of the music too, of course. And those early albums really speak to me a lot. I think after like Float On, and I don't think Float On is a bad song or that's a bad album, but I just stopped paying attention to Modest Mouse. I got into different types of music. But I still go back to Lonesome Crowded West and It's a Long Drive for Someone with Nothing to Think About, and Moon in Antarctica a lot. I think my favorite Modest Mouse song is probably Trailer Trash. I don't think that's a super interesting favorite Modest Mouse song. I think a lot of people love Trailer Trash, but I heard a kid who was like my age when I was playing a metal show. This kid was like opening up the show, and he sat on the ground with like a crappy acoustic guitar and played a bunch of songs that I didn't realize were covers. Like I think he did like an Elliott Smith song. But at one point I heard him singing, yeah, of course I'm going to forget the lyric, but like eating snowflakes with plastic forks and the paper plates, of course. You think of everything, I think is the line. And it really made me stop. Like I was in the back of the club and I was like, what is this person singing? Where is this from? I didn't know it was a Modest Mouse song. And it was pretty cool to hear that live. And that's always been one of my favorite songs, Trailer Trash. But really, I love Lonesome Crowded West front to back, and most of those early albums I love front to back. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for humoring me with the Modest Mouse trivia.
Of
And
course. Yeah,
thank
I
you
was
for
so glad
joining
that
me.
you connected with that story, and you picked out a lot of the a lot of the references too. That was really cool.
No, it was way fun. I spent probably way too much time doing it, but when you're doing something fun, time flies, right? So,
Absolutely.
well, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah.
If you
Thanks, Matt.
haven't, check out Tyler's book, Eternal Night at the Nature Museum, or his chapbook, The Quiet Part Loud. Tyler, again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. I gotta say, the depth with which you read the book and really looked into this story and others is it's such a gift. Like I couldn't imagine people spending this much time with the book and connecting with it in the ways that I connect with it. So I'm so glad you reached out, and thanks for helping me spread the word about it. So
Not a problem. Well, when you love something, that's what you do, right?
yeah, absolutely.
All right, thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Matt.